right, welcome everybody. My name is Catherine Zipf, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bristol Historical and Preservation Society. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is a conversation with Suzanne Cherau. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping details for us. I would just like to quickly run through our code of conduct, just to remind everybody. You should have received this with emails and confirmations, but just to make sure, we ask that you please assume positive intent on the part of all participants. Please avoid making judgments about others and speak only for yourself. Please respect other program attendees, presenters, and staff members with word choice. Please avoid inflammatory or offensive comments, especially those that are likely to disrupt, provoke, attack, or offend others. Those making those comments will be removed from the meeting. And lastly, please do not share any personal information, including email addresses, during this presentation. I'm recording this presentation, and a link to it will be emailed to all of those who had signed up afterwards. So if you object to being recorded, this would be an excellent moment to leave the event. So welcome. One last housekeeping detail: in order to make sure that everybody has the best possible viewing experience, I have muted everybody and I have turned everybody's camera off. I don't mean it to silence you, but more to make sure that everybody's internet can handle the conversation to the best possible. And not everybody's internet is the same. So less data going through really does matter, and it has made for a better experience. That said, I would like to encourage everybody, this is supposed to be a conversation, and please, please, please chime in with questions on the chat feature. You may also raise your hand if you'd like to do that, and we can unmute and you can ask Suzanne directly. But we have been finding that the chat feature works very, very well. So again, welcome, and this is a really wonderful conversation to have. Suzanne and I have spoken quite a bit about her distillery project, and so I'm excited to have her share with you. I'm delighted to introduce Suzanne. Suzanne is a graduate of Georgetown University and the Université de Dijon-Bourguignon in France. Did I get that at all right?
Kind of, close enough.
Kind of, okay. I'm afraid it was Spanish for me. Suzanne is a registered professional archaeologist and has worked as a senior archaeologist / principal investigator for the Public Archaeology Lab, Inc., PAL, if you're familiar, since 1987. She has directed an impressive 450 cultural resource management projects in New England, New York, and New Jersey. Wow. And her specialties also include archaeological predictive modeling, New England historic, urban, and industrial archaeology, including mill dam removal, which we are slowly working on up in Warren. It's not a mill dam, but it's a dam. And historic preservation planning. And so this is quite a lovely resume, and we welcome Suzanne to talk to us about the Pierce Distillery. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me.
So Suzanne, I really think the best question to begin these conversations is, how did you come to this project? Can you tell us a little about how this project came to be? And along with that, we might need to quickly say a little bit about what the project was.
Right, so we started this project back in 2007. I can't believe, 13 years ago. I was thinking about that earlier today while I was preparing. And it was part of the, what they called the Thames Street Belvedere Court development project. And it was, you know, taking the old Belvedere Hotel and turning it into, I guess, like a mixed retail condominium, and then putting in a multi-level garage facing Thames Street. So the hotel is on Hope Street, the garage was going to be facing Thames Street. And I don't know if many of you recall, but it was basically an open lot, that area that fronted Thames Street behind the hotel. So because it was an open lot, and primarily because it's that whole area is within the Bristol Waterfront National Register Historic District, there was a heightened sensitivity for archaeological resources. So the Rhode Island State Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission was reviewing the project as part of a coastal resource management council zoning, because it's within 200 feet of a coastal waterway. And as part of the state's review, they identified, the archaeological sensitivity and basically, requested of the developer that they do this archaeological survey. They requested, but essentially it's required under the Coastal Resource Management Council. It's like section 220, I believe, that requires some kind of cultural resources archaeological study if warranted. So if the state commission asks for it. So my company is a private nonprofit cultural resource management firm. So we were contacted by the developer himself, who begrudgingly acknowledged that he would have to do this type of archaeological investigation. And I'm sure he thought it'll be no big deal. They'll go in, they'll do their little dig, and then I'll be done with it. And that could have very well been the way it happened, because when we initially came in, all we were seeing on like 19th century Sanborn insurance maps and other town maps were just, primarily houses, ones that were multi-story, had like a commercial store on the ground level, and then, probably some kind of apartments, where people were living on the upper story. And they fronted Thames Street and Main Street, that whole block was primarily, commercial / residential opposite the waterfront. So, while that's interesting, 19th century type, there's plenty that are still standing. So I think archaeologically it would have been neat, but would it have been something significant? Probably not so much, So we were just, digging and doing our thing, and started coming down on these wooden vats, these fermentation vats. And we thought we just had a series of maybe privies, the outhouses to some of these structures, maybe, early 1800s. And, doing some more research and some more digging, we realized that we had more than one or two of these. There were dozens, and we were like, what the heck is going on? So we basically had to stop and do some homework and get into the deeds of this property, because the historic maps weren't really telling us anything. So it was really the deeds that gave us our first clues that we were looking at a distillery, which of course made sense because we were in downtown Bristol on the waterfront. And so once that happened and we were able to identify it being a distillery, it took on a life of its own, so to speak, with the State Historical Commission, who got, very involved and had, called meetings with the developer and apprised him of what was going on, and said, this is very significant because this will be, one of the first times that we'll be able to archaeologically, professionally study a rum distillery in coastal Rhode Island, essentially, even though there were, probably 100 of these distilleries in colonial times. The areas have all been built over, so they're considered pretty rare finds. So that's it in a nutshell. That's how we got involved in this. And it's the profession. It's what we do. The company does. So we're not like a university that comes in. We have to do things to meet the developer schedule. So everything happens pretty quickly in this business. Yeah, we wish we had the luxury of taking more time, but we have to keep moving because the developers have schedules and everyone tries to accommodate that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a different world from university archaeology.
It is. Contract archaeology is really different. Can't believe I've been doing it for over 30 years, because a lot of people just come and go. They just, you have to really pick and choose, not just the sites, but your battles that you have with developers and agencies too, state and federal agencies.
So you talked a little about this as you were telling us about how the site came together. Can you tell us a little bit more about rum production in New England in general, and why this site would be so significant and also such a rare find? It was rare, yes?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say that out of all of the rum distilleries that dotted the entire eastern seaboard, really, from probably Boston to the Carolinas, there's only been four that have been, identified and looked at in some archaeological fashion. So you can imagine, and four, including this one. So in 2007, when we found this site, the magnitude of its importance was extreme. There had been one other rum distillery, only one, in Boston, believe it or not, and Boston probably had, over 100 rum distilleries just, in and around that greater metropolitan area at one time. So there was one found during the Central Artery Project, the Big Dig, and that was in the 80s. And more recently, now about 20 years ago, there had been a rum distillery, a very large commercial production distillery up the Hudson River in Albany, called the Dow Quackenbush Distillery. And that one was excavated. That one was primarily to make rum to feed the British soldiers. So it was not a colonial. It was a British production that they were doing there. It started during the French and Indian War, and then lasted into actually, I think the Continental Army took it over during the Revolution, and once they got into New York, and ran it until the early 1800s. But and then the other two were both right here in Bristol. One being the DeWolf, we call it the DeWolf Finney Distillery, which is kind of kitty corner across the street, down in the basement of the brick building that's there today. And there was a very quick archaeological survey that was done in the basement of that building during renovations. They uncovered some wooden vats and part of what looked like a still base, and did some very quick recordation. But it still, was identified as an archaeological site before the developer finished refinishing the basement or whatever. So this was number 4, and as far as I know, it still is. There haven't been any new ones found since. So, and that's interesting to me 13 years later. But the more development that happens, and not everyone has to do a survey. So, sites could be there and they could be being destroyed because, backhoes and heavy machinery, they don't see these fragile resources until it's too late. And even then they're like, oh, maybe that was something, but it's gone now. So who knows what it was, just a bunch of wood and stone and maybe some bottles that come up in the back dirt. So, so yeah, I mean, you can imagine out, in Newport, there have been none that have been recorded archaeologically. So, I mean, there's still some land that hasn't been fully developed. So they could be in the future, but, we'd always be on the lookout for that. But it definitely, I mean, Bristol should be proud in the sense that they have 2 of the 4 in the entire United States from the colonial period that have ever been recovered and recorded archaeologically. Yeah.
Yeah, I hold that over the executive director of the Newport Historical Society's head from time to time.
Oh yeah, good for
have a
you.
distillery.
Definitely, it's definitely something to talk about because it proves that even in the 21st century, there are still important archaeological sites in the very heavily developed coastal zone of Rhode Island that, speak to the entire maritime industry that was so prevalent, in the 18th and 19th century. So we've lost so much of it. I mean, essentially all of it. So, except for, buildings that have survived. But,
Yeah. Yeah, it is striking given how many distilleries there were out there that we really have only found four is really rather remarkable.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little, when you were in the ground, what did you see in the ground? Can you tell us a little about what did it look like when you were digging it up?
Yeah, so, like I said, at first we found these kind of wooden boxes that looked like potentially the bottoms of privies, of outhouses. But we opened up more and more. We were using machinery to open, because we were about, I think when we saw the tops of these wooden boxes, we were already a couple of feet below the parking lot pavement that was there. We had removed all the asphalt, and we're removing, what we were calling 20th and 19th century fill materials. And we actually did see, I'll go back to those commercial kind of residential structures from the Sanborn maps. We did see part of the foundation of one of those buildings, and a capped well in the backyard. And that had impacted a little portion of the site for sure when they built that. Probably anywhere from 40 to 50 years after the distillery went out of business. So at that point, it was already forgotten about, even historically. And so we were able to work around that disturbance that was historic in and of itself, but it had covered in part and disturbed or destroyed in part the distillery building. Probably could have been reusing a lot of materials that were left behind by the distillery owners, or the property owners at that time. So these wooden vats, we found 22 rectangular vats side by side in a series of, I think, like 8 or 10 rows of these vats, about 4 to 5 each. There was an area where there was really a lot of disturbance, and we calculated based on the sizes and positioning that there could have been 10 more vats. So these fermentation vats. So they were, their boxes, they were roughly, 2 feet by 4 feet, not huge structures at all, but definitely in an alignment with little kind of walkways, in between them. And they were built with planks and all assembled using wooden pegs. There were no nails, no hardware. And that was understandable because the fermentation process, you wouldn't have wanted with the acids that were naturally being created in there, they wouldn't have wanted any seepage or contamination from metal. So they were keeping it as pure as possible. Getting a metallic taste in proof rum, I'm sure, was not something that they wanted their customers to experience. So that was the practice of the day, definitely. And then they basically set them in like a blue marine clay. I mean, they were packed watertight in this clay. And we figured that the clay was just, locally obtained, right there, probably close to the waterfront. And these vats, when we were doing our excavations over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, we had some rainy days in there, and these vats were still so watertight. I mean, the wood was so well preserved. They were still retaining water after rainstorms. I mean, it was amazing to us. What was left of them looked like it was new wood that had gone in the ground. So that's the type of environment that they had just been abandoned in, between the marine clay, the watertight, compaction, and then the wet, the damp environment. We call that very anaerobic. It doesn't have much oxygen in it when it's covered in fill. And the preservation was just unbelievable. You wouldn't have even thought that they were, close to 200 years old at that time. So, and then we did also find the circular brick still base. So the base that would have had the firebox where they would have been heating the fermented mixture obtained from the vats, and actually in the process of distilling, using like a copper, we call it a copper still, a copper device that would have been heated to produce steam, and then condensation that they could collect the droplets of the liquor at that point, and put it into containers to then transfer to either bottles or to hogsheads, to casks for sale. So it was just amazing. I mean, to see. There was also a larger circular vat next to the still, and that was probably used to either collect the condensed droplets, the liquor, or for like the waste, kind of the residual. And they would reuse that. They would either add that back into the fermentation vats, or they would distill it again, and sometimes you would do 2 or 3 different distillations. Of course, it would keep reducing the proof, but they could make like what they call the low wine rum, so it wasn't the best quality, but they could probably sell it locally or just give it to their workers. And it wasn't the quality that they would sell, wholesale, but it was more waste not, want not. They were using everything that they had. So and then we did find some artifacts that definitely spoke to the distillery process. We had not a lot of bottle glass. You would think a distillery, you're going to have like tons of green, bottle glass that they would have put the liquor in, and there wasn't a lot. We did find an interesting artifact that had it was like a wooden piece of a rack that the bottles would have been attached to with their corks, and so we suspect that there was some bottling that was done there, but not on a scale that we would think was like a wholesale or even necessarily a retail scale. The distillers did have a shop across the street on the wharf side, and they could have definitely been selling, some rum locally for consumption. But it looks like, the primary production was in hogsheads, in barrels, for shipping, to other, well, they probably shipped south. It probably initially at that point, the triangle trade had eased a bit, so it was probably more for consumption to New York and points south. And that's where they were shipping to at that point. Yeah, there could have still been some voyages going on. We know that there was still some trafficking after the laws, abolishing slavery, and the triangle trade went into place. So there still was some going on, even into the 1820s and 1830s. So, yeah.
Now, Paul is asking, may we see a plan or drawing of the finds? And Paul, you will be pleased to hear that Suzanne did indeed prepare some images. And I thought, right, Suzanne, maybe while you were sharing your screen, I would just quickly back up to answer Matt's question. Matt's question is, what plaques or kiosks mark the area and give info of the dig and the findings? Matt, the answer is none. The area is private property, and this is, for those following, this is Jim Reuter, the developer who wanted to put the large building on the site that was defeated after multiple runs through the compliance process. And so there are none around. I remember at the time that there was sort of a little bit of secrecy going on about this dig, that there was concern that the dig would be disturbed or looted. And it was kind of, Bristol's best kept secret for a little while there. So I think it's not overly well known that that's what it was. So.
Right. Can you see my screen at this point? Good. This is this is actually from a PowerPoint from a presentation that I gave back in 2019. And then also I did a presentation for the Historical Society probably about a year or two after we had completed the dig and the analysis. But this is an interesting image because it it's like the bird's eye view of our dig site. And this is when we first started going in there. And if you look real closely, there's a pickup truck pulled in to the site off Thames Street, a white pickup truck. And just, in front of that are some of the first vats that we started to expose. And it was amazing to us because I'll show a site plan. The distillery, we really have it all. I mean, we have the entire footprint in this open lot. It did not, the building itself did not extend beyond the area that we were able to open up for the Belvedere development. So this is looking down, of course, from one of the upper levels of the Belvedere when it was under construction. And the part of the secrecy was the, and I can say it now, I could have never said it back then, but the union groups that were working, the pipe fitters, the electricians that were working on the Belvedere at the time, they were using this as a parking lot for themselves, for their cars. You can see next to it, they've kind of all had to move their cars over. They also had a lot of equipment there, and they were super annoyed when we came in as archaeologists and kind of took over this whole lot that they were using for staging and access. And even so much so that at one point, when we had a huge area opened up, they called OSHA on us. And we ended up having an OSHA inspection. And the inspector, I was there that day, he was, he was very by the book, and he was checking everything out, the depth of our trenches, the types of soils, whether we had or needed any shoring. So they were really trying to get us in trouble, get us off the site, make us go away. And we, of course, were just fearful that they would come in and do, not looting for artifacts, but just destruction, because there was resentment that we were, impeding on their workspace. So that was part, I know the State Historical Commission got involved, and that was part of it, just trying to keep it out of the papers, trying to draw as little attention to it as we possibly could. So I love this image. I wish we had one when it was all opened up, but somebody with the Belvedere took this and sent it to us. So, because we never went up onto their, into their workspace. But it's interesting too, because here you can see how the distillery would have been within this orange dashed oval that I have here. But then across the street, as part of the distillery property, there was a store and there was a wharf. So they had their own wharf. They could have, been working together with merchants who had the ships. And the store, it was absolutely with products that were being sold locally. So it was really, for several years, possibly no more than a decade, it was a nice, enterprise that the distiller and his partners had going. And then, of course, the DeWolf distillery was just down the street. Thames Street was really the center of the distilleries in Bristol from the 1700s until the last site, which we think could have been this one. By the 1820s, this could have been it. When this one went out of business sometime in the late 1820s, early 1830s, we have no evidence that anybody was doing any rum distilling in the town after that. And even in Boston, it was really, there was very little going on. And Newport, it was pretty much all gone by then too. Of course, we had the temperance movement was kicking in full swing by then, 1820s, 1830s, and whiskey was really taking over as the alcohol of choice. Rum was on its way out, and whiskey production had really ramped up. So looking at, let's see, a footprint. These are some images of the vats when we were first uncovering them. So you can see the size, the scale, compared to the archaeologists working there. I mean, they weren't huge, but they certainly, in number, were enough to ferment quite a bit of molasses to keep the still in production and making, I think I had some numbers that we estimated that based on its size and the number of vats, that this distillery could have been producing 250 gallons of proof rum per day. So that was a lot, which would have been about 6 days a week, about 1,500 gallons a week, and up to 75,000 gallons a year at full capacity. So those numbers make it a relatively large scale operation when we compare records from distilleries in Boston or even Newport or elsewhere in the colonies. So for several years, this was really quite the production of rum based on the size and number of the vats that they had. Let's see.
Yeah, while you have the wood up, Kendall had wanted to know what species of wood the vats were made from. Do you know?
Yes, that's a great question. From pine, actually. And pine would have been the preferred wood because it would not have imparted any type of flavor into the molasses mixture. You know how for wine, oak it gives it kind of that musty, rustic, that flavor that's really sought after. Whereas with rum, you didn't want anything. You didn't want that metallic taste. You just wanted the sweet molasses, natural scent to be in that drink. So pine, and they were all made of pine. And that's why I said, I think I've got some images of excavated one. There's one at the bottom. I mean, the wood, you really wouldn't think that these were, like I said, almost 200 years old. The residue staining, that's molasses, right there, still on the boards that we could. These were filled. Some of them actually had like a straw, almost a hay in them, and we think that they were perhaps they used that to help clean, to try to break up and get out maybe some of the gunk, the waste that would accumulate over time. Yeah, I can see the planking in the one on the right. Again, some more residue staining in it. I mean, these are, look at the wood. It was just amazing to see these vats when the machines came in when we were done. To see what the developer, the machinery just ripping these up. It breaks your heart, because you're like, wow, these have survived in the ground for this long, and now we have to have a parking lot on top of them. So that must go. But you can see how the water just from rain, was still being held in. That's how watertight. And that clay around them, I mean, it was like cement, to try to even excavate with our trowels and our shovels around it. It was amazing. It must have been quite a job to get that in there and make these so incredibly watertight. And they would reinforce sometimes with the side planks that you can see in the images. So the wooden pegs, the dowels, the way these were held together. Showing some of the peg holes, like I said, no nails, no hardware, no metal hardware at all. So we didn't excavate them all. We just didn't have time. We would have loved to have excavated every one of them. But, we did. We were able to get some dimensions and do a nice representation, figuring that they were probably each about 5 feet high. So, someone could stand and then stir and clean. The water that they would bring in, all of the distilleries on Thames Street were fed by water that came from a natural spring to the northeast. So, and it was all gravity fed. So coming down from the, I guess, what is it now? Metacom, coming down the way the natural topography flows towards the coastline. So because the water, they would want clean water. They weren't going to make the rum mixture with the dirty water, you know, even rainwater. They wanted clean, the cleanest, freshest water they could get. Let me see. This is the circular vat that I said we think may have been used to actually like a condensation tub, actually holding the condensed liquor from the still. Again, that was pine as well. The still base, let's see. And I think I have, wanted to find the image. Oh, this is the wine, yeah, the bottle rack with the bottle and the cork still attached. So that was really an interesting find. You know, it made a lot of sense. Finding a bottle cork and then several of the cask bungs. You know, it all came together in terms of artifacts and the structures. These are other artifacts we found just, you know, around the site. This is interesting because we've reconstructed the building here, the distillery building, showing this is where the still base was, this round vat, and then you can see these rows of the fermentation vats and the outline of the building that we estimate was probably about 22 feet wide by about 80 feet long. So it was a good size structure that would have had, you know, like, you know, large loading doors, probably on both long sides for access to the backyard area and then to the street side for loading across the street to the wharf and the store that they had.
So we have a couple of questions, but let's start with were the artifacts saved? And if so, where are they?
Yeah, so my company, Public Archaeology Lab, we're in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we have a very large curation facility inside of our building. And the artifacts right now are all stored in our climate controlled curation facility. They've been cataloged, so we have a computer catalog of every single artifact. We know where it was found on the site. Everything is provenienced, and they have that information is on tags, on acid-free tags that are in acid-free bags with the artifacts. And those are in acid-free, you know, curatorial boxes and in this climate controlled room. At one point, James Reuter did want, he was funny, he didn't want the entire collection because, you know, as I was scrolling through some, there's a lot of broken dishes and bottles, and most of that actually is probably related to the later 19th century home and shop occupations and not the distillery itself. So he wanted to kind of pick and choose some of the nicer pieces for himself. And the state historical folks got involved and said, well, first of all, we don't allow breaking up a collection. You know, you either take it all or you don't take any of it. And second of all, we really frown on a collection going into private hands like that. Many states have laws that protect artifacts and say that anything that comes out of the ground, no matter where it's found or how it's found, like in Massachusetts, for example, belongs to the Commonwealth if it's older than 50 years. Rhode Island doesn't have a law per se, like a written law that you could, you know, point to in a court of law if there was ever any type of legal proceeding, but you can definitely, you know, use a lot of other state and even federal regulations to kind of persuade people strongly to do the right thing and not take the artifacts. So they're safe and sound at our place of business, and we would be more than happy to deaccession the collection because we do get full. we fill up and we deaccession. We are right now the state repository for Rhode Island for all state projects in Rhode Island. And we know there's a plan to potentially do some renovation work at URI in one of the buildings and create a state kind of museum slash archive. It's been sidelined because of COVID, obviously, like everything else. But you know, it's still a plan that we're hoping happens someday soon, because we would really like to have like all of the Rhode Island Department of Transportation collections, which are so numerous, you know, go to a formal state designated repository. So, because we do work all over the Northeast. So we have collections, and many states are like Rhode Island. They just don't know where to put these collections, and collections that go back to the 70s even. And, you know, there's really, if we didn't take them, what would happen? Some we have collected from like, even the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission from their basement, and they've been just all full of bugs. And you can imagine, you know, so we've had to have them debugged and cleaned. And so it becomes a real costly endeavor to take care of these collections for future generations to come. Yeah, but the collections aren't just the things, they're all the paperwork, the maps, the photographs, the reports, everything that goes with it, so you can understand the context of those artifacts as well. So.
Yes, we've had a helpful comment that says you should put them in the Bristol Historical Society, and I agree, and I hadn't forgotten.
We talked about that.
We did, I know, and I flaked on writing the letter for you, but yeah. I'll get on. Put it on my list.
Yeah, I think we've probably got the equivalent of maybe 2 Hollinger size boxes. So, or you and I have talked about how much.
We have, yeah. No,
yeah, it's not huge, but you got to find the space, you know.
Yeah, and it would be neat to do an exhibit on it, which we could do at our.
It really would, yeah, it would. Because probably now I'm thinking, gosh, we're over a decade. You know, that I'm sure there's generations in Bristol who, you know, wouldn't have even been around to know when this happened. So this is a good way to tell people, hey, there was stuff being found and going on in town that we can all learn about, you know. So yeah. So
while we have the plan up, Vinny would like to know, how did you get the rum from the vats to he has rights from the vats to the barrels? I guess maybe we should talk about the whole process there. Yeah, the process, right. So it's a really simple, rum making is really simple. It amazes me that people don't do it today. But I mean, they would get the molasses, you know, right off the merchant ships coming in right to Bristol, you know, right to the port, and put it in these fermentation vats. There would be a mixture with the clean water that I was talking about, and that would have come in from piping that we think was mostly overhead, because we did not find evidence of like underground drainage systems. And the fact that the vats were so tightly packed in that clay, it might just have been prohibitive. So it made more sense to have the piping come in overhead, and we just didn't, you know, archaeologically, we just weren't seeing any footprints. So they would, you know, almost all the work would have been done by hand. So they would have been mixing probably 3 parts water with 1 part molasses in these fermentation vats, and the kind of the natural yeast in the air that was just in the air. They didn't have to add like a leavening agent. Just the natural air would create that chemical, you know, process. It would kick in almost on its own. They really didn't have to do much. They would stir it, you know, to just kind of get the juices flowing, basically. But those were really the two ingredients, and it would ferment to however long it took to reach a consistency, I think they said, where you could float a hard-boiled egg on top of it. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of different anecdotal, like how they would do it and how they knew it was time. But we imagine that a lot of it was done with moving the mixture, because it wasn't even a liquor yet,
but moving that to the still was probably done by hand. And we did find bits and pieces of buckets, wooden buckets, wooden handles, and they could have definitely had some kind of like piping system. We know that there was a horse whim, if anyone knows what that is. It's like a water wheel, a granite millstone, but it's actually turned by horsepower instead of water power, because this wasn't a water powered mill, for example. So here they could have had a horse whim. It could have been near where we identified the stone lined well with this granite cap in this image. It could have been outside. We just don't know, but that could have been used to power a pumping system to actually pump the fermented mixture, out of the vats and then over to the well. So we're missing infrastructure. We wish we had found that. We looked, but didn't. So we kind of have to, extrapolate and use methods from other rum distillery productions that were either written about or that were identified, like in Boston or at the Quackenbush, and kind of, imagine how the fermented mixture found its way up to the still. But we definitely have like a workspace, production. You've got your the part of the distillery where the fermentation was taking place, and then we've got where the distilling was taking place, up near the still base, and those other smaller rectangular vats could have been used again to collect distilled liquor, the waste, and then to redistill it, a second time or a third time. That round wooden vat was very large, the circumference. That could have absolutely been, where they were holding the distilled liquor, and where they were casking it, right there in that part of the distillery. Yeah. So we did not find the still. We do not have the copper still or any of the equipment, and that I'm sure that would have been sold, by the distillers when, because that could have been even used in a different type of distillery, like a whiskey distillery. So anyone could have bought that, or they could have bought it just, for the copper, just for the material itself. So yeah.
So we have a couple of questions about the history of the site, and it's not something we had really talked about. From Kenny, is it known who was making rum during this period of time? And then why did whiskey replace rum? And then where is the relationship between the rum and the triangle trade? And I think that what people are wondering about, we haven't really talked about when this distillery came into operation, who was running it, when it came out of operation. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the history of that. I know it intersects with the whiskey, with the rise of whiskey, and then with the decline of the slave trade.
Right.
So if you can tell us a little about that knot of issues, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, well, sure. And unfortunately, it'll be a quick discussion because we don't know a lot about the distillers who were operating this particular establishment. We know that the distiller himself, his name was Jarvis Pierce. But unfortunately, other than his name and the fact that he was living in Bristol in 1820, we found him in the census records, the federal census records, and he was living there with his wife, and he had 2 children. We really don't know even when he was born or when he died. So we've searched online records, local records, and sometimes that's just the case. They were just kind of everyday people, and no one really wrote anything about their lives. And we do know from the deeds, the most we know about him is really from the deeds, that he was in partnership with his brother, who was named Joseph, and that he had 2 other partners, a gentleman named Nathaniel Payne and another one named Thomas Lindsay, and they were all living in Bristol, and they were identified as merchants. So, you know, maybe one ran the store, one kind of ran the wharf, you know, Jarvis was the distiller, maybe his brother was involved. Distilleries like this, even of this magnitude, only had like 2 or 3 workmen. They didn't need a lot of people, you know, to stand around and watch the molasses ferment. They kind of let it do its own thing, and then one guy ran the still, and it wasn't labor intensive in that sense. You know, they could pretty much do it with not a lot of help, which I'm sure helped keep the expenses down. But anyways, the deed that we have that they established the distillery was sometime between 1822 and 1823, which in the grand scheme of things was pretty late. The other distilleries in Bristol had been going on since before the Revolution, since the early 1700s, so for a long time. So it was a bit odd to us that these, you know, 4 merchants would get together and start a distillery, a rum distillery, when, you know, the slave trade, the triangle trade was really, you know, slowing down. There had, you know, already been 2 laws passed. One in 1787, abolishing slavery, and then again another law in Rhode Island in 1807 that was supposed to be firmer. No, we really mean it. We're really doing it. So the you know, the trade for molasses, you know, they were seeing a real shortness in supply, but apparently these guys, we think that perhaps they bought the still and the equipment from James DeWolf, who had inherited the DeWolf distillery business that was also called the Finney Distillery across the street. And he didn't seem to have much interest in it. He had his hands in a lot of other enterprises, businesses. He didn't, his writings indicate that he just didn't think it was very profitable. It wasn't making the profit that he thought it should in the 1820s. So these 4 merchants might have just gotten together and said, hey, we can get that equipment at a low price, because he admitted in one of his documents that he was going to sell it at like a quarter the cost, you know. And Jarvis, we don't know, but he may have come from somewhere and he knew the trade. So he, you know, he could set this up at probably not too much expense. And it seems like it was a real venture, you know, a money-making venture that they got into. And it looks like it was pretty profitable. Now, why it all kind of fell apart, maybe less than a decade later, so certainly within their generation, you know. Jarvis's brother Joseph died. He was very young. He died at 34. We were able to find him in the vital statistics. We don't know what he died of, but Jarvis inherited his share. So he ended up with a full half share in the business. And he sold to a merchant, he sold his half share to a merchant from Newport. So Newport, you know, was getting a little involved, and maybe they had a distiller, their own distiller, who came up and kept it going. The other 2 gentlemen, you know, may still have had the store and the wharf going. But then the Newport merchant sold it to another merchant from Boston. So it all ended up in the hands of a Boston merchant who we think probably just bought it to take the equipment, you know, to just get his hands on perhaps some cheap equipment. And, you know, the supply in Bristol and Newport, you know, I think Boston probably was still at that time, they were a bigger port, they might have still been getting better, steadier supplies of molasses and whatever else they needed. And for Bristol, it just wasn't making enough money. So we don't know what happened to Jarvis. We don't know if he left Bristol, if he stayed here. I can't even find him in the Rhode Island Cemetery database.
Mm.
So if anyone ever finds out who he was and what happened, it would be really interesting because the story continues to be told. You know, who were these people, and where did they come from, and what did they do while they were here, and then where did they end up? You know,
Mm.
and maybe what did their children do? You know, and so on. And are there any family generations still left in the area? You know, it's always interesting
Yeah.
to follow those family generations. So I hope that gives a little bit of a history. You know, the triangle trade was really big. I mean, New England, you know, really the first leg was New England to West Africa, and they would bring the British kind of luxury goods to Africa, to the rum, the product, the rum product, and trade for the slaves. And then they would continue the voyage, the second leg, to the Caribbean, to the West Indies. And there, you know, some percentage of rum and some of the slaves would be sold to plantations, because the rum was, the molasses was all from sugar plantations. So they needed the slaves for the sugar plantations. And then the third leg, you know, was back to New England with probably not much rum left at that point, but a lot of molasses, and enough slaves to sell also for profit when they came back home to home ports. So yeah, that triangle trade is what kept businesses like this going, and what gave merchants the incentive to get into a business like this, even for a couple of years. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the size of the operation certainly speaks to some sort of export commodity here. There is no way, or rather, I suppose that the town of Bristol could consume all that rum, but it wouldn't be a very pretty picture.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things is that the Bristol distilleries, you know, even the 3 or 4 that were still operating into the early 1800s, along with, say, you know, 20 some odd distilleries in Newport, were producing, listen to this, 90% of the rum consumed in the entire eastern US and shipped
Wow.
to Africa in the slave trade. Yeah,
Yeah.
90%. I mean, it was, people, I think, can't even fathom that. They're like, wow, you know, that is unbelievable that 90% of the rum consumed and used in the triangle trade came from little old Rhode Island. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
Now, can you tell us what happens with whiskey?
You know, I don't. I knew someone was going to ask that, and I didn't, and I did research it. You know, I really don't know. I mean, whiskey is your grain, you
Mhm.
know, your grain alcohol. So I'm sure there's a slightly different, you know, production, distillation production. But why did whiskey take over as the liquor of choice? I'm not really sure. Maybe my husband would know. I don't know. But those whiskey drinkers out there, you know, it may have just been a whole lot cheaper to make, and grain being available everywhere, not just in coastal locations, but, you know, it's the westward expansion with, you know, the vast amount of agricultural lands. Almost anybody could make whiskey. So it could have been, it was cheaper, it was more available. You know, I'm sure that had to do with it. And rum, with the dwindling of the slave trade, and probably, you know, much fewer and reliable supplies of molasses, was probably a lot less available. And the few distilleries that were still operating, like in Boston, they probably weren't selling it cheap either. It just wasn't like the Coca-Cola anymore that it used to be, you know. Whiskey was, because everybody could have a still, and everybody could make it. Yeah. So
I think you've made it sound so easy that some archaeologist in the future is going to find all these early 21st century vats in the backyard of all the suburban
right.
households in Bristol.
What's
Vinny
going
has
on?
yeah. So Vinny has a technical question. He would like to know, what does the EU stand for?
Oh yeah, EU. EU is excavation unit. So that's where we actually did an archaeological, you know, controlled troweling down into these. Like I said, we only excavated a few of the vats because we just didn't have time. That's where academic versus contract archaeology. If this had been, say, a field school and someone had had 2 or 3 seasons, they could have excavated them all. So unfortunately, the shaded areas are only the ones that we got to excavate down to the bottoms. Yeah. So, yeah.
And then another terrific question from Kenny. If rum was so easy to make, was it possible that there were any home distillers involved in making rum for the triangle trade or even for local use?
You know, there could definitely have been. I mean, that's how it started. You know, that is how 17th century, well, I mean, coming over from Europe, right, from England and primarily England, they were, it was actually, you know, what the woman did in the kitchen. They made the rum, they made the alcohol, and it was just a kind of just another cooking task that they would do. So it was totally a home endeavor, you know, and it didn't really start to become commercialized until the triangle trade really kicked in the second half of the 17th century, when the merchants realized that, hey, we can get molasses out of these sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, and we can do this on a large scale up in the colonies, and we can make a lot of money doing this. So that's when it kind of got taken, you know, out of the house. I'm sure there were still people doing it, you know, for their own consumption, if they could get the molasses. I mean, there again, they, you know, I don't really know how easy it would have been to go to a ship and say, hey, can I can I buy a cask of molasses? And you know, where the merchants all had contracts, you know, everything was contract based at that point. You know, it was a real, I mean, you know, a real economic setup that they had, you know, market setup that they had going. So.
Yeah, I think when I read your report, it really was delightful to have an explanation for this. And Raphael, thanks you kindly for the visual description of rum making. And you know, I think it's a very big piece of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I, in my head, have the vision of Hawkeye Pierce on MASH with a still in the tent. But of course, this was a massive industrial operation.
Yeah, yeah, because of the fermentation,
right.
That's what took up so much space.
Yeah. And I had always wondered why you didn't make rum down in the Caribbean. But of course, it would be a space issue because the space would be so much better designated for growing sugarcane than it would allowing its even you know, this was really not a huge operation. And Raphael points out taxes.
Right, and exactly.
Yeah, that too. And a quick comment from Lynn, from 1817 to 1862, American whiskey distillers did not pay taxes, while New England rum producers were highly taxed.
Oh, well, there you go.
Foreign spirits were impeded with high tariffs. So that's Time Magazine, How Whiskey Bested Rum.
Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Consumers paid upwards of 300% more for rum than whiskey. Wow. Thank you, Lynn. Very helpful.
Wow. Well, that would help contribute to the decline, right?
Yes.
Rum and the rise in the whiskey. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. There you go. Yep.
Yeah, so something to look into, and we'll see if it comes up in a future scholar is maybe they do transfer it down to the Caribbean. It might, with the taxes, it might be.
Right. There's a good book, and it's called The Whiskey Rebellion, and I think that it has a lot of let's see, I can go to oops.
That's okay.
Did I lose my screen sharing?
Yes, but that's okay.
I wanted to go to back to my PowerPoint though, because I did have, and this would be a good way to maybe wrap things up too. I did have a further reading. Let's see if I can just get that in this show. There you go. Can you all see that? Yeah. Yep. So that, you know, if anyone's interested, The Whiskey Rebellion, The Alcohol Republic, that's another one that's really good by Rora Bao. you know, just some reading up on the subject. I think you know, read parts of these books years ago when we were doing this site, but if anyone's interested, sure. And then our report is up there, and I know you have a copy,
Yes, we
Catherine.
do. Mhm. Yes, we do.
And I think I even gave it to you as a PDF too. So
You did, and now I'm going to have an influx of email tomorrow morning.
I know.
That's okay. That's okay. We're happy to
Site,
share.
unfortunately, isn't there anymore, so it's not like, you know, we have to afford continued protections. But so, you know, it's hopefully the report is an educational, you know, tool, as well as you know, testament to the site, the importance of the site. So.
Oh no, it's excellent. It's an excellent report, and I'm happy to share.
Good.
Suzanne, I just want to give anybody last minutes for questions, if anybody has any. And in the interim, Vinny notes rum is made in Cuba and the Caribbean and Bermuda, as I learned on my college spring break.
Yeah, so today,
yeah. And I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through the Pierce Distillery and what rum production was like. This has been very, really wonderful and educational, and I'm so glad that you guys found this site and
yeah, me too.
Everything that you could with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
It's, so far it's a 1 in a million find, really.
Yeah.
No one has found another one. So I'd love to see someone come across, and then we could do some real comparison. You know, it's hard to, I mean, we compared in our report with the Henley Distillery in Boston, and that was very helpful. But the more of these you find, the more you can understand, you know, how they were really, you know, that Yankee ingenuity was really being put to good use. So, yeah.
Well, no doubt I will hear immediately if one is found in Newport.
Then let me know, please.
I will.
I'd love to know that.
Yeah. I will happily.
Incredibly cool.
Yeah, it really would. I don't mean to rub Newport's face in it, because it actually really would be pretty fabulous. Theirs would probably be older than ours.
It'll be older, and it probably will be bigger.
And bigger, yeah. That would all be very important.
Pretty typical, right?
Suzanne, thank you again. The thank yous are all rolling in, and we really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure we can find Suzanne off the Public Archaeology Lab website if you need any questions or such. And thank you everyone for joining us. Next week, a week from tonight, we have Charlotte Carrington Farmer to talk about the equine trade, and specifically the Narragansett Pacer, which was a horse bred specifically for the equine trade to the Caribbean and its intersection with the slave trade. So Charlotte Carrington Farmer next week. Signups should be available, same place, same time. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much, everybody. It's really been a treat tonight. Thank you, Suzanne.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, for organizing this. Really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.